Hi, this is Brad, and welcome to Brad English Podcast, your daily English listening podcast helping you speak English naturally. On the 17th of March 2025, a 32-year-old man named Marco Ferretti, who worked as a mid-level accountant at a fashion distribution company in the Navigli district of Milan, Italy, sat at his office desk at lunchtime and made a decision that he later described as the most consequential decision of his adult life. The decision was this: he would become fluent in English within 12 months, using only the resources he already had, within the hours he already had available, without quitting his job or significantly disrupting his life. He had made versions of this decision before. 3 times in the previous 5 years, he had started English learning programs and abandoned them after 6 to 8 weeks. This time, he told himself it would be different, not because he was more motivated, because he was more honest with himself about what had failed and why. By March 2026, exactly 12 months after sitting at his desk in the Navigli district of Milan, Marco had been promoted to a senior position that had previously required a minimum IELTS score of 7.0. He was now conducting international client calls in English with confidence. He was applying for positions with multinational companies based in London and Dublin, and he had a vocabulary of over 3,000 English words, 200 of which you are about to learn through the story of his 12-month journey. Marco's life in March 2025 was, by most conventional measures, respectable. He had a stable job, a modest apartment in the Porta Romana neighborhood of Milan, a small but close circle of friends, and a family that was proud of him. But Marco was not proud of himself in the way he wanted to be, and this distinction between being respected by others and genuinely respecting yourself was one that had been growing uncomfortably large in his mind for about 2 years. The source of the discomfort was specific and honest. He was stuck. The word stuck, in English, means being unable to move forward, trapped in a position from which progress seems impossible. Marco felt stuck in his career, stuck at a level he had reached too quickly and been unable to go beyond, stuck at the edge of an opportunity he could see clearly but could not access. The barrier between Marco and the next level of his career was English, not his intelligence, his skills, his work ethic, or his professional knowledge, all of which were genuinely strong. English, the senior positions in his company, the international client relationships, the presentations to buyers from London, Dublin, and New York. All of these required English fluency, and Marco's English was functional but not fluent. He could read English reports and understand them. He could write a grammatically acceptable email given enough time and revision. But in real-time spoken interaction, he was hesitant, slow, and deeply self-conscious. Self-conscious means uncomfortably aware of yourself and how you appear to others. The 3 previous attempts to fix this had all followed the same pattern. Marco would enroll in or commit to a program with genuine enthusiasm. For the first 4 to 6 weeks, the enthusiasm would sustain him through the early stages of visible but slow progress. Then would come a period when the progress plateaued, which means it stopped being visible. Then would come a week of unusual pressure at work or a family commitment. Then the habit would break. Then the guilt would arrive. Then the guilt would make restarting feel embarrassing and difficult. This pattern, the cycle of intention, initial effort, and eventual abandonment, is so common in English learning that researchers have a name for it: the attrition cycle, where attrition means the gradual loss of something through consistent reduction. The structural problem was not motivation. It was method. And on the 17th of March 2025, sitting at his desk in the Navigli district of Milan with a lunch he had barely eaten, Marco was finally honest enough with himself to see it clearly. He needed a different kind of method, one that built around his life rather than requiring his life to stop and make room for it. One that treated consistency as more important than intensity. He pulled out a piece of paper, wrote 3 words at the top, "What actually works," and began. 3 days after making his decision, Marco had a conversation that gave the method its first concrete direction. He was at a Friday dinner at the home of a colleague named Julia, who had spent 4 years working for a British consulting firm in London before returning to Milan. Julia spoke English with the effortless, unself-conscious fluency that Marco aspired to, and after dinner, Marco asked her directly, "What did you actually do that made the biggest difference?" Julia's answer was not what Marco expected. She did not talk about courses or tutors or immersion programs. She talked about shadowing, which is the technique of listening to natural English audio and speaking along with it simultaneously, mimicking the sounds, rhythm, and speed of the speaker as closely as possible. Julia described the shadowing technique with a specific metaphor that stayed with Marco for the entire 12 months that followed. She said, "Your English knowledge is like water in a deep well. Shadowing is the pump. Without the pump, you know the water is there, but you cannot get it out quickly enough to use it. Shadowing builds the pump." The word pump, in this metaphor, represents the automatic production system that converts stored language knowledge into real-time spoken output. Marco wrote it down that same evening in the notebook he had bought specifically to document his 12-month journey. Marco also discovered, through the conversation with Julia and through subsequent research, in the following week, 3 concepts that fundamentally changed how he understood language learning. The first was automaticity, which means the quality of being automatic, requiring no conscious attention. The second was input hypothesis, a theory proposed by linguist Stephen Krashen, suggesting that language is acquired most effectively through comprehensible input. The third was output hypothesis, which argues that producing language, speaking and writing, is essential not just for practice, but for noticing gaps in your knowledge that listening alone would not reveal. These 3 concepts, automaticity, input hypothesis, and output hypothesis, gave Marco a framework for designing a method that was not just a collection of activities, but a coherent approach, based on how language learning actually works in the human brain. He began designing his daily practice on the 22nd of March 2025, 5 days after his lunchtime decision in the Navigli district. Marco now had his decision and his framework. What he did not yet have was the courage to begin, because beginning meant confronting the specific thing he had been avoiding for 5 years, speaking English badly, out loud, where he could hear himself doing it. Part 2 begins on the first day of practice, and what happened that morning is something I think you will recognize. On the morning of the 23rd of March 2025, in his apartment in the Porta Romana neighborhood of Milan, Marco sat down with his phone, a pair of headphones, and a notebook, and began his first shadowing session. He chose a slow English podcast designed for intermediate learners. He pressed play. He heard the first sentence. He tried to speak along with it simultaneously. What came out was, by his own description, a complete disaster. The words were too fast, the sounds were unfamiliar at speaking speed, and the experience of hearing his own voice producing broken, misaligned imitations of a fluent speaker was mortifying. Mortifying means causing an intense feeling of shame or embarrassment. He kept going. For 15 minutes, he kept speaking along with the audio. Even when it felt wrong, even when his version barely resembled the original, even when the gap between the fluent voice in his headphones and the awkward voice coming from his own mouth felt like evidence that this would never work. At the end of 15 minutes, he wrote one sentence in his notebook: "This is going to take longer than it feels like it should." Then he went to work in the Navigli district. The next morning, he did it again. The morning after that, again. By the end of the first month, April 2025, the shadowing had become less mortifying. The words were a little more aligned with the audio. The rhythm of his spoken English, which had previously been almost robotic in its syllable-by-syllable delivery, was beginning to take on some of the natural musicality of the podcast speaker. Musicality, in language, means the rising and falling, the speeding and slowing, the stress and unstress that makes spoken English sound natural rather than mechanical. This improvement in rhythm was the first small victory, and Marco noted it in his notebook with a single word: progress. The second month, May 2025, added an evening practice component that Marco designed based on the output hypothesis. Every evening for 10 minutes, he wrote in his notebook in English about his day, using as many words as he could from the vocabulary he had encountered during that day's listening sessions. By the end of May, his notebook contained over 3,000 words of English that he had written himself in his own voice about his own life in Milan. That volume of personal English output was, he later said, one of the most underestimated things he did in his entire 12 months. The breaking point came in June 2025, the third month. Marco had a particularly difficult week at work, a project audit that went badly, a confrontation with a senior manager that left him shaken, and 3 consecutive evenings of working past 10 o'clock. He missed 3 consecutive days of his morning shadowing session for the first time since he had started. On the 4th day, the guilt arrived. He described it as a specific kind of guilt that is also a kind of grief, the feeling of having let yourself down by breaking a promise you made to yourself. He nearly did not restart. The urge to treat the 3 missed days as evidence that he was not capable of maintaining the habit was strong and specific, and came with a ready-made narrative. This is what always happens. I always stop. I was right to be skeptical. That narrative, which psychologists call self-defeating attribution, because it attributes failure to a fixed personal characteristic rather than a specific circumstance, is one of the most dangerous patterns in long-term habit formation. Marco recognized it, not immediately, but after 2 days of the guilt, when he reread the opening pages of his notebook and reminded himself of the structural problem he had identified on the 17th of March. He restarted on the 4th of June 2025, a Wednesday. He did not begin with the full session. He did the minimum: 5 minutes of shadowing in the morning, 5 minutes of English writing in the evening. The minimum was not satisfying. It was not what he had hoped to do. But it continued the chain, and continuing the chain was more important than the quality of any single day's practice. By the end of the following week, he had returned to his full sessions. Marco survived his breaking point. The chain continued. And what happened in the second half of his 12 months was something that no amount of advanced preparation could have fully predicted. Part 3 begins in September 2025, when Marco's English reached a threshold that changed not just how he spoke but how his colleagues saw him, how his managers responded to him, and ultimately what was possible in his professional life in Milan and beyond. Do not stop before you hear it. In September 2025, 6 months into his 12-month journey, Marco was asked unexpectedly by his manager to join an international video call with buyers from a company based in Dublin, Ireland. His manager had assumed Marco would participate mainly as a silent observer. What happened instead was that Marco, drawing on 6 months of daily shadowing and evening writing practice, participated actively in the conversation, answered 3 direct questions from the Dublin buyers clearly and correctly, and made 1 unsolicited observation about the seasonal collection data that the buyers responded to with visible appreciation. His manager, watching from across the room in the Navigli office, said nothing during the meeting. Afterward, he said 1 sentence: "That was a surprise, Marco. A good one." The international call in September 2025 was the moment Marco's professional environment began to change around him. He was included in subsequent international communications that previously would have been handled by senior team members. He was invited to present a section of a quarterly report to visiting partners from London in November 2025. a responsibility that had never before been given to someone at his level. His daily interactions with colleagues shifted in a subtle but significant way. People began asking for his opinion on communications with international partners, treating him as someone whose English judgment was reliable and useful. Marco's personal life changed in ways that were less visible but equally real. His relationship with English media transformed. British and Irish television programs that he had previously watched with Italian subtitles he now watched without them. Books in English that he had previously found slow and effortful he now read with genuine pleasure. His ability to access information in English improved dramatically, and with it, his access to professional knowledge, industry news, and international perspectives on his field. In January 2026, 2 months before the anniversary of his decision, Marco was called into his manager's office and told that the company was creating a new senior position in international client relations, and that he was being considered for it. The position required demonstrated English fluency. Marco completed the evaluation in February 2026. The evaluators, 2 of whom were native English speakers from the company's London and Dublin offices, assessed his English as B2 to C1. The position was offered on the 14th of February 2026. Marco accepted it on the same day. He called his mother in Brescia to tell her. She asked him to say something in English, and he did for 3 minutes, describing everything that had happened in the past year. She listened, and when he finished, she said in Italian, "I understood everything." He laughed for a long time. The 200 words embedded in Marco's story are not chosen randomly. They are the words that appear most frequently in the kind of English that changes lives. Professional English, conversational English, the English of ambition, decision, setback, persistence, and transformation. Words like consequential, which means having important consequences or effects, and plateau, which means a period of little or no progress after a period of improvement, and mortifying, which means causing intense shame, and automaticity, which means the quality of happening automatically without conscious effort, and self-conscious, which means uncomfortably aware of yourself and how others perceive you. Each of these words appeared in Marco's story, because each of these words describes something Marco actually experienced in his Navigli district office and his Porta Romana apartment in Milan. The vocabulary of change and growth includes words that are essential for anyone navigating a serious learning journey. Persistence, which means continuing firmly despite difficulty or opposition. Resilience, which means the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. Threshold, which means the point at which something begins to happen or have an effect. Momentum, which means the force or energy that keeps something moving forward. Compound, as in compound effect, which means the effect of something building on itself over time to produce results much larger than the individual components. These are not difficult words to understand. They are difficult words to encounter enough times to make them available for use. There are also words in Marco's story that speak to the emotional interior of the experience of learning a language and changing your life through it. Mortified, which describes the feeling of the first terrible shadowing session. Grief, used to describe the guilt of missed practice days. Surprise, in the mouth of a manager who did not expect what he was witnessing. Appreciation, in the eyes of the Dublin buyers who heard an unexpected and useful observation. Laughter, long and real, at the end of a phone call on the 14th of February 2026. These words, the emotional ones, the human ones, are the ones that will stay with you longest. Marco Ferretti, 33 years old, Senior International Client Relations Executive, Navigli District Office, Milan, Italy, March 2026. One decision, one notebook, one pump built from daily practice over 12 months. 200 words learned through the story of what it actually costs and what it actually feels like to change your life through English. Every one of those words is yours now, not as a list, as a life. as evidence that the thing you want is not imaginary and not impossible, as proof that the decision you make today is capable of producing something genuine and transformative by the time the same date arrives next year. Marco's story ends on the 14th of February 2026 with a phone call to his mother in Brescia and 3 minutes of English that she could completely understand. But in another sense, it does not end at all, because what Marco built in 12 months is not a skill that peaks and declines. It is a foundation that will keep growing for the rest of his life. Every English conversation he has from now on makes the foundation stronger. Every book he reads, every international call he takes, every moment he thinks in English rather than translating, adds another layer. The 200 words you learn today through his story are your foundation stones. They are yours because you heard them in context, attached to emotion, inside a real human narrative. That is how language actually enters a person and stays. Not through memorization, through story. Keep listening to this podcast. Keep encountering words inside stories that mean something. Build your foundation one story at a time. I will see you in the next episode.